Chapter 90 of The Count of Monte Cristo. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 90. The Meeting. After Mercédès had left Monte Cristo, he fell into profound gloom. Around him and within him the flight of thought seemed to have stopped. His energetic mind slumbered, as the body does after extreme fatigue. "What," said he to himself, while the lamp and the wax lights were nearly burnt out, and the servants were waiting impatiently in the anteroom, "what this edifice which I have been so long preparing, which I have reared with so much care and toil, is to be crushed by a single touch, a word, a breath? Yes, this self, of whom I thought so much, of whom I was so proud, who had appeared so worthless in the dungeons of the Château d'If, and whom I had succeeded in making so great, will be but a lump of clay tomorrow. Alas, it is not the death of the body I regret, for is not the destruction of the vital principle, the repose to which everything is tending, to which every unhappy being aspires, is not this the repose of matter after which I so long sighed, and which I was seeking to attain by the painful process of starvation, when Faria appeared in my dungeon? What is death for me? One step farther into rest, two, perhaps, into silence. No, it is not existence, then, that I regret, but the ruin of projects so slowly carried out, so laboriously framed. Providence is now opposed to them when I most thought it would be propitious. It is not God's will that they should be accomplished. This burden, almost as heavy as a world, which I had raised, and I had thought to bear to the end, was too great for my strength, and I was compelled to lay it down in the middle of my career. Oh, shall I then again become a fatalist, whom 14 years of despair and 10 of hope had rendered a believer in Providence? And all this because my heart, which I thought dead, was only sleeping, because it has awakened and has begun to beat again, because I have yielded to the pain of the emotion excited in my breast by a woman's voice. Yet," continued the count, becoming each moment more absorbed in the anticipation of the dreadful sacrifice for the morrow which Mercédès had accepted, "yet it is impossible that so noble-minded a woman should thus through selfishness consent to my death when I am in the prime of life and strength. It is impossible that she can carry to such a point maternal love, or rather delirium. There are virtues which become crimes by exaggeration. No, she must have conceived some pathetic scene. She will come and throw herself between us, and what would be sublime here will there appear ridiculous." The blush of pride mounted to the count's forehead as this thought passed through his mind. "Ridiculous?" repeated he, "and the ridicule will fall on me. I ridiculous? No, I would rather die." By thus exaggerating to his own mind the anticipated ill fortune of the next day, to which he had condemned himself by promising Mercédès to spare her son, the count at last exclaimed, "Folly, folly, folly! To carry generosity so far as to put myself up as a mark for that young man to aim at! He will never believe that my death was suicide. And yet it is important for the honor of my memory, and this surely is not vanity but a justifiable pride. It is important the world should know that I have consented by my free will to stop my arm, already raised to strike, and that with the arm which has been so powerful against others, I have struck myself. It must be. It shall be." Seizing a pen, he drew a paper from a secret drawer in his desk, and wrote at the bottom of the document, which was no other than his will, made since his arrival in Paris, a sort of codicil, clearly explaining the nature of his death. "I do this, O my God," said he, with his eyes raised to heaven, "as much for thy honour as for mine. I have during 10 years considered myself the agent of thy vengeance, and other wretches, like Morcerf, Danglars, Villefort, even Morcerf himself, must not imagine that chance has freed them from their enemy. Let them know, on the contrary, that their punishment, which had been decreed by Providence, is only delayed by my present determination, and although they escape it in this world, it awaits them in another, and that they are only exchanging time for eternity." While he was thus agitated by gloomy uncertainties, wretched waking dreams of grief, the first rays of morning pierced his windows, and shone upon the pale blue paper upon which he had just inscribed his justification of Providence. It was just 5 o'clock in the morning, when a slight noise like a stifled sigh reached his ear. He turned his head, looked around him, and saw no one, but the sound was repeated distinctly enough to convince him of its reality. He arose, and quietly opening the door of the drawing-room, saw Haydée, who had fallen on a chair, with her arms hanging down and her beautiful head thrown back. She had been standing at the door, to prevent his going out without seeing her, until sleep, which the young cannot resist, had overpowered her frame, wearied as she was with watching. The noise of the door did not awaken her, and Monte Cristo gazed at her with affectionate regret. "She remembered that she had a son," said he, "and I forgot I had a daughter." Then, shaking his head sorrowfully, "Poor Haydée," said he, "she wished to see me, to speak to me. She has feared or guessed something. Oh, I cannot go without taking leave of her. I cannot die without confiding her to someone." He quietly regained his seat, and wrote under the other lines: "I bequeath to Maximilian Morrel, captain of spies, and son of my former patron, Pierre Morrel, ship-owner at Marseilles, the sum of 20 millions, a part of which may be offered to his sister Julia and brother-in-law Emmanuel, if he does not fear this increase of fortune may mar their happiness. These 20 millions are concealed in my grotto at Monte Cristo, of which Bertuccio knows the secret. If his heart is free, and he will marry Haydée, the daughter of Ali Pasha of Yanina, whom I have brought up with the love of a father, and who has shown the love and tenderness of a daughter for me, he will thus accomplish my last wish. This will has already constituted Haydée heiress of the rest of my fortune, consisting of lands, funds in England, Austria, and Holland, furniture in my different palaces and houses, and which without the 20 millions and the legacies to my servants, may still amount to 60 millions. He was finishing the last line when a cry behind him made him start, and the pen fell from his hand. "Haydée," he said, "did you read it?" "Oh, my lord," said she, "why are you writing thus at such an hour? Why are you bequeathing all your fortune to me? Are you going to leave me?" "I am going on a journey, dear child," said Monte Cristo with an expression of infinite tenderness and melancholy, "and if any misfortune should happen to me—" The count stopped. "Well?" asked the young girl, with an authoritative tone the count had never observed before, and which startled him. "Well, if any misfortune happen to me," replied Monte Cristo, "I wish my daughter to be happy." Haydée smiled sorrowfully and shook her head. "Do you think of dying, my lord?" said she. The wise man, my child, has said it is good to think of death." "Well, if you die," said she, "bequeath your fortune to others, for if you die I shall require nothing." And taking the paper, she tore it in 4 pieces, and threw it into the middle of the room. Then, the effort having exhausted her strength, she fell, not asleep this time, but fainting on the floor. The Count leaned over her, and raised her in his arms, and seeing that sweet pale face, those lovely eyes closed, that beautiful form motionless, and to all appearance lifeless, the idea occurred to him for the first time that perhaps she loved him otherwise than as a daughter loves a father. "Alas!" murmured he, with intense suffering, "I might, then, have been happy yet." Then he carried Heidi to her room, resigned her to the care of her attendants, and returning to his study, which he shut quickly this time, he again copied the destroyed will. As he was finishing, the sound of a cabriolet entering the yard was heard. Monte Cristo approached the window and saw Maximilian and Emmanuel alight. "Good," said he, "it was time." And he sealed his will with 3 seals. A moment afterwards he heard a noise in the drawing-room, and went to open the door himself. Morrel was there. He had come 20 minutes before the time appointed. "I am perhaps come too soon, Count," said he, "but I frankly acknowledge that I have not closed my eyes all night, nor has any one in my house. I need to see you strong in your courageous assurance, to recover myself." Monte Cristo could not resist this proof of affection. He not only extended his hand to the young man, but flew to him with open arms. "Morrel," said he, "it is a happy day for me to feel that I am beloved by such a man as you. Good morning, Emmanuel. You will come with me then, Maximilian?" "Did you doubt it?" said the young captain. "But if I were wrong?" "I watched you during the whole scene of that challenge yesterday. I have been thinking of your firmness all night, and I said to myself that justice must be on your side, or man's countenance is no longer to be relied on." "But, Morrel, Albert is your friend?" "Simply an acquaintance, sir." "You met on the same day you first saw me." "Yes, that is true, but I should not have recollected it if you had not reminded me." "Thank you, Morrel." Then, ringing the bell once, "Look," he said to Ali, who came immediately, "take that to my solicitor. It is my will, Morrel. When I am dead, you will go and examine it." "What," said Morrel, "you dead?" "Yes. Must I not be prepared for everything, dear friend? But what did you do yesterday after you left me?" "I went to Tortoni's, where, as I expected, I found Beauchamp and Château Renaud. I own I was seeking them." "Why, when all was arranged?" "Listen, Count, the affair is serious and unavoidable." "Did you doubt it?" "No, the offence was public, and everyone is already talking of it." "Well?" "Well, I hoped to get an exchange of arms, to substitute the sword for the pistol. The pistol is blind." "Have you succeeded?" asked Monte Cristo quickly, with an imperceptible gleam of hope. "No, for your skill with the sword is so well known." "Ah, who has betrayed me?" "The skilful swordsman whom you have conquered." "And you failed?" "They positively refused." "Morrel," said the count, "have you ever seen me fire a pistol?" "Never." "Well, we have time. Look." Monte Cristo took the pistols he held in his hand when Mercédès entered, and fixing an ace of clubs against the iron plate, with 4 shots he successively shot off the 4 sides of the club. At each shot Morrel turned pale. He examined the bullets with which Monte Cristo performed this dexterous feat, and saw that they were no larger than buckshot. "It is astonishing," said he, Look, Emmanuel!" Then turning towards Monte Cristo, "Count," said he, "in the name of all that is dear to you, I entreat you not to kill Albert. The unhappy youth has a mother." "You are right," said Monte Cristo, "and I have none." These words were uttered in a tone which made Morrel shudder. "You are the offended party, count." "Doubtless. What does that imply?" "That you will fire first." "I fire first?" "Oh, I obtained, or rather claimed that. We had conceded enough for them to yield us that." "And at what distance?" 20 paces." A smile of terrible import passed over the count's lips. "Morrel," said he, "do not forget what you have just seen." "The only chance for Albert's safety, then, will arise from your emotion." "I suffer from emotion?" said Monte Cristo. "Or from your generosity, my friend. To so good a marksman as you are, I may say what would appear absurd to another." "What is that?" "Break his arm, wound him, but do not kill him." "I will tell you, Morrel," said the count, "that I do not need entreating to spare the life of M. de Morcerf. He shall be so well spared that he will return quietly with his 2 friends, while I—" "And you?" "That will be another thing. I shall be brought home." "No, no!" cried Maximilian, quite unable to restrain his feelings. "As I told you, my dear Morrel, M. de Morcerf will kill me." Morrel looked at him in utter amazement. "But what has happened, then, since last evening, count?" "The same thing that happened to Brutus the night before the battle of Philippi. I have seen a ghost." "And that ghost—" "Told me, Morrel, that I had lived long enough." Maximilian and Emmanuel looked at each other. Monte Cristo drew out his watch. "Let us go," said he. "It is 5 minutes past 7, and the appointment was for 8 o'clock." A carriage was in readiness at the door. Monte Cristo stepped into it with his 2 friends. He had stopped a moment in the passage to listen at a door, and Maximilian and Emmanuel, who had considerately passed forward a few steps, thought they heard him answer by a sigh to a sob from within. As the clock struck 8, they drove up to the place of meeting. "We are first," said Morrel, looking out of the window. "Excuse me, sir," said Baptistin, who had followed his master with indescribable terror, "but I think I see a carriage down there under the trees." Monte Cristo sprang lightly from the carriage and offered his hand to assist Emmanuel and Maximilian. The latter retained the count's hand between his. "I like," said he, "to feel a hand like this, when its owner relies on the goodness of his cause." "It seems to me," said Emmanuel, "that I see 2 young men down there, who are evidently waiting." Monte Cristo drew Morrel a step or 2 behind his brother-in-law. "Maximilian," said he, "are your affections disengaged?" Morrel looked at Monte Cristo with astonishment. "I do not seek your confidence, my dear friend, I only ask you a simple question. Answer it, that is all I require." "I love a young girl, count." "Do you love her much?" "More than my life." "Another hope defeated," said the count; then, with a sigh, "Poor Haydée," murmured he. "To tell the truth, count, if I knew less of you, I should think that you were less brave than you are." "Because I sigh when thinking of some one I am leaving? Come, Morrel, it is not like a soldier to be so bad a judge of courage. Do I regret life? What is it to me, who have passed 20 years between life and death? Moreover, do not alarm yourself, Morrel. This weakness, if it is such, is betrayed to you alone. I know the world is a drawing-room, from which we must retire politely and honestly, that is, with a bow, and our debts of honor paid." "That is to the purpose." Have you brought your arms?" "Ay, what for? I hope these gentlemen have theirs." "I will inquire," said Morrel. "Do but make no treaty, you understand me?" "You need not fear." Morrel advanced towards Beauchamp and Château who, seeing his intention, came to meet him. The three young men bowed to each other courteously, if not affably. "Excuse me, gentlemen," said Morrel, "but I do not see Monsieur de Morcerf." "He sent us word this morning," replied Château "that he would meet us on the ground." "Ah," said Morrel. Beauchamp pulled out his watch. "It is only 5 minutes past 8," said he to Morrel. "There is not much time lost yet." "Oh, I made no allusion of that kind," replied Morrel. "There is a carriage coming," said Château It advanced rapidly along one of the avenues leading toward the open space where they were assembled. "You are doubtless provided with pistols, gentlemen. Monsieur de Monte Cristo yields his right of using his." "We had anticipated this kindness on the part of the count," said Beauchamp, "and I have brought some weapons which I bought 8 or 10 days since, thinking to want them on a similar occasion. They are quite new, and have not yet been used. Will you examine them?" "Oh, Monsieur Beauchamp, if you assure me that Monsieur de Morcerf does not know these pistols, you may readily believe that your word will be quite sufficient." "Gentlemen," said Château "it is not Morcerf coming in that carriage. Faith, it is Franz and Debray." The two young men he announced were indeed approaching. "What chance brings you here, gentlemen?" said Château shaking hands with each of them. "Because," said Debray, "Albert sent this morning to request us to come." Beauchamp and Château exchanged looks of astonishment. "I think I understand his reason," said Morrel. "What is it?" "Yesterday afternoon I received a letter from Monsieur de Morcerf, begging me to attend the opera." "And I," said Debray. "And I also," said Franz. "And we too," added Beauchamp and Château "Having wished you all to witness the challenge, he now wishes you to be present at the combat." "Exactly so," said the young men. "You have probably guessed right." "But after all these arrangements, he does not come himself," said Château "Albert is 10 minutes after time." "There he comes," said Beauchamp, "on horseback at full gallop, followed by a servant." "How imprudent," said Château "to come on horseback to fight a duel with pistols, after all the instructions I had given him." "And besides," said Beauchamp, "with a collar above his cravat, an open coat, and white waistcoat. Why has he not painted a spot upon his heart? It would have been more simple." Meanwhile Albert had arrived within 10 paces of the group formed by the 5 young men. He jumped from his horse, threw the bridle on his servant's arms, and joined them. He was pale, and his eyes were red and swollen. It was evident that he had not slept. A shade of melancholy gravity overspread his countenance, which was not natural to him. "I thank you, gentlemen," said he, "for having complied with my request. I feel extremely grateful for this mark of friendship." Morrel had stepped back as Morcerf approached, and remained at a short distance. "And to you also, Monsieur Morrel, my thanks are due. Come, there cannot be too many." "Sir," said Maximilian, "you are not perhaps aware that I am Monsieur de Monte Cristo's friend?" "I was not sure, but I thought it might be so. So much the better. The more honorable men there are here, the better I shall be satisfied." "Monsieur Morrel," said Château "will you apprise the Count of Monte Cristo that Monsieur de Morcerf is arrived, and we are at his disposal." Morrel was preparing to fulfil his commission. Beauchamp had meanwhile drawn the box of pistols from the carriage. "Stop, gentlemen," said Albert. "I have 2 words to say to the Count of Monte Cristo." "In private?" asked Morrel. "No, sir, before all who are here." Albert's witnesses looked at each other. Franz and Debray exchanged some words in a whisper, and Morrel, rejoiced at this unexpected incident, went to fetch the Count, who was walking in a retired path with Emmanuel. "What does he want with me?" said Monte Cristo. "I do not know, but he wishes to speak to you." "Ah," said Monte Cristo, "I trust he is not going to tempt me by some fresh insult." "I do not think that such is his intention," said Morrel. The Count advanced, accompanied by Maximilian and Emmanuel. His calm and serene look formed a singular contrast to Albert's grief-stricken face, who approached also, followed by the other 4 young men. When at 3 paces distant from each other, Albert and the Count stopped. "Approach, gentlemen," said Albert. "I wish you not to lose one word of what I am about to have the honor of saying to the Count of Monte Cristo, for it must be repeated by you to all who will listen to it, strange as it may appear to you." "Proceed, sir," said the Count. "Sir," said Albert, at first with a tremulous voice, but which gradually became firmer, "I reproached you with exposing the conduct of M. de Morcerf in Epirus, for guilty as I knew he was, I thought you had no right to punish him, but I have since learned that you had that right. It is not Fernand Mondego's treachery toward Ali Pasha which induces me so readily to excuse you, but the treachery of the fisherman Fernand towards you, and the almost unheard-of miseries which were its consequences. And I say, and proclaim it publicly, that you were justified in revenging yourself on my father, and I, his son, thank you for not using greater severity." Had a thunderbolt fallen in the midst of the spectators of this unexpected scene, it would not have surprised them more than did Albert's declaration. As for Monte Cristo, his eyes slowly rose toward heaven with an expression of infinite gratitude. He could not understand how Albert's fiery nature, of which he had seen so much among the Roman bandits, had suddenly stooped to this humiliation. He recognized the influence of Mercédès, and saw why her noble heart had not opposed the sacrifice she knew beforehand would be useless. "Now, sir," said Albert, "if you think my apology sufficient, pray give me your hand. Next to the merit of infallibility which you appear to possess, I rank that of candidly acknowledging a fault. But this confession concerns me only. I acted well as a man, but you have acted better than man. An angel alone could have saved one of us from death. That angel came from heaven, if not to make us friends, which, alas, fatality renders impossible, at least to make us esteem each other." Monte Cristo, with moistened eye, heaving breast, and lips half open, extended to Albert a hand which the latter pressed with a sentiment resembling respectful fear. "Gentlemen," said he, "Monsieur de Monte Cristo receives my apology. I had acted hastily towards him. Hasty actions are generally bad ones. Now my fault is repaired. I hope the world will not call me cowardly for acting as my conscience dictated. But if any one should entertain a false opinion of me," added he, drawing himself up as if he would challenge both friends and enemies, "I shall endeavor to correct his mistake." "What happened during the night?" asked Beauchamp of Château. "We appear to make a very sorry figure here." "In truth, what Albert has just done is either very despicable or very noble," replied the baron. "What can it mean?" said Debray to Franz. "The Count of Monte Cristo acts dishonorably to M. de Morcerf, and is justified by his son. Had I 10 Yaninas in my family, I should only consider myself the more bound to fight 10 times." As for Monte Cristo, his head was bent down, His arms were powerless. Bowing under the weight of 24 years' reminiscences, he thought not of Albert, of Beauchamp, of Château Renaud, or of any of that group, but he thought of that courageous woman who had come to plead for her son's life, to whom he had offered his, and who had now saved it by the revelation of a dreadful family secret, capable of destroying forever in that young man's heart every feeling of filial piety. "Providence still," murmured he. "Now only am I fully convinced of being the emissary of God." End of chapter 90.
Chapter 91 of the Count of Monte Cristo. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 91. Mother and Son. The Count of Monte Cristo bowed to the 5 young men with a melancholy and dignified smile, and got into his carriage with Maximilian and Emmanuel. Albert, Beauchamp, and Château Renaud remained alone. Albert looked at his 2 friends, not timidly, but in a way that appeared to ask their opinion of what he had just done. "Indeed, my dear friend," said Beauchamp first, who had either the most feeling or the least dissimulation, "allow me to congratulate you. This is a very unhoped-for conclusion of a very disagreeable affair." Albert remained silent and wrapped in thought. Château Renaud contented himself with tapping his boot with his flexible cane. "Are we not going?" said he, after this embarrassing silence. "When you please," replied Beauchamp. "Allow me only to compliment Monsieur de Morcerf, who has given proof today of rare chivalric generosity." "Oh, yes," said Château Renaud. "It is magnificent," continued Beauchamp, "to be able to exercise so much self-control." "Assuredly. As for me, I should have been incapable of it," said Château Renaud, with most significant coolness. "Gentlemen," interrupted Albert, "I think you did not understand that something very serious had passed between Monsieur de Monte Cristo and myself." "Possibly, possibly," said Beauchamp immediately, "but every simpleton would not be able to understand your heroism, and sooner or later you will find yourself compelled to explain it to them more energetically than would be convenient to your bodily health and the duration of your life. May I give you a friendly counsel? Set out for Naples, The Hague, or St. Petersburg, calm countries, where the point of honor is better understood than among our hot-headed Parisians. Seek quietude and oblivion, so that you may return peaceably to France after a few years. Am I not right, Monsieur de Château Renaud?" "That is quite my opinion," said the gentleman. "Nothing induces serious duels so much as a duel forsworn." "Thank you, gentlemen," replied Albert, with a smile of indifference. "I shall follow your advice, not because you give it, but because I had before intended to quit France. I thank you equally for the service you have rendered me in being my seconds. It is deeply engraved on my heart, and, after what you have just said, I remember that only." Château Renaud and Beauchamp looked at each other. The impression was the same on both of them, and the tone in which Morcerf had just expressed his thanks was so determined that the position would have become embarrassing for all if the conversation had continued. "Good-bye, Albert," said Beauchamp suddenly, carelessly extending his hand to the young man. The latter did not appear to arouse from his lethargy. In fact, he did not notice the offered hand. "Good-bye," said Château Renaud, in his turn, keeping his little cane in his left hand and saluting with his right. Albert's lips scarcely whispered "good-bye," but his look was more explicit. It expressed a whole poem of restrained anger, proud disdain, and generous indignation. He preserved his melancholy and motionless position for some time after his two friends had regained their carriage. Then suddenly unfastening his horse from the little tree to which his servant had tied it, he mounted and galloped off in the direction of Paris. In a quarter of an hour he was entering the house in the Rue de Helder. As he alighted, he thought he saw his father's pale face behind the curtain of the Count's bedroom. Albert turned away his head with a sigh, and went to his own apartments. He cast one lingering look on all the luxuries which had rendered life so easy and so happy since his infancy. He looked at the pictures, whose faces seemed to smile, and the landscapes, which appeared painted in brighter colors. Then he took away his mother's portrait with its oaken frame, leaving the gilt frame from which he took it black and empty. Then he arranged all his beautiful Turkish arms, his fine English guns, his Japanese china, his cups mounted in silver, his artistic bronzes by Faucheres and Berrier, examined the cupboards, and placed the key in each, threw into a drawer of his secretary, which he left open, all the pocket money he had about him, and with it the 1,000 fancy jewels from his vases and his jewel boxes. Then he made an exact inventory of everything, and placed it in the most conspicuous part of the table, after putting aside the books and papers which had collected there. At the beginning of this work, his servant, notwithstanding orders to the contrary, came to his room. "What do you want?" asked he, with a more sorrowful than angry tone. "Pardon me, sir," replied the valet. "You had forbidden me to disturb you, but the Count of Morcerf has called me." "Well," said Albert. "I did not like to go to him without first seeing you." "Why?" "Because the Count is doubtless aware that I accompanied you to the meeting this morning." "It is probable," said Albert. "And since he has sent for me, it is doubtless to question me on what happened there. What must I answer?" "The truth." "Then shall I say the duel did not take place?" "You will say I apologized to the Count of Monte Cristo. Go." The valet bowed and retired, and Albert returned to his inventory. As he was finishing this work, the sound of horses prancing in the yard, and the wheels of a carriage shaking his window, attracted his attention. He approached the window, and saw his father get into it, and drive away. The door was scarcely closed when Albert bent his steps to his mother's room, and no one being there to announce him, he advanced to her bedchamber, and, distressed by what he saw and guessed, stopped for one moment at the door. As if the same idea had animated these two beings, Mercédès was doing the same in her apartments that he had just done in his. Everything was in order: laces, dresses, jewels, linen, money, all were arranged in the drawers, and the Countess was carefully collecting the keys. Albert saw all these preparations and understood them, and exclaiming, "My mother!" he threw his arms around her neck. The artist who could have depicted the expression of these two countenances would certainly have made of them a beautiful picture. All these proofs of an energetic resolution, which Albert did not fear on his own account, alarmed him for his mother. "What are you doing?" asked he. "What were you doing?" replied she. "Oh, my mother!" exclaimed Albert, so overcome he could scarcely speak. "It is not the same with you and me. You cannot have made the same resolution I have, for I have come to warn you that I bid adieu to your house, and to you." "I also," replied Mercédès, "am going, and I acknowledge that I had depended on your accompanying me. Have I deceived myself?" "Mother," said Albert with firmness, I cannot make you share the fate I have planned for myself. I must live henceforth without rank and fortune, and to begin this hard apprenticeship I must borrow from a friend the loaf I shall eat until I have earned one. So, my dear mother, I am going at once to ask France to lend me the small sum I shall require to supply my present wants. You, my poor child, suffer poverty and hunger? Oh, do not say so, it will break my resolutions. But not mine, mother, replied Albert. I am young and strong. I believe I am courageous, and since yesterday I have learned the power of will. Alas, my dear mother, some have suffered so much and yet live, and have raised a new fortune on the ruin of all the promises of happiness which heaven had made them, on the fragments of all the hope which God had given them. I have seen that, mother. I know that from the gulf in which their enemies have plunged them, they have risen with so much vigor and glory that in their turn they have ruled their former conquerors, and have punished them. No, mother, from this moment I have done with the past, and accept nothing from it, not even a name, because you can understand that your son cannot bear the name of a man who ought to blush for it before another. Albert, my child, said Mercédès, if I had a stronger heart, that is the counsel I would have given you. Your conscience has spoken when my voice became too weak. Listen to its dictates. You had friends, Albert. Break off their acquaintance. But do not despair, you have life before you, my dear Albert, for you are yet scarcely 22 years old, and as a pure heart like yours wants a spotless name, take my father's. It was Herrera. I am sure, my dear Albert, whatever may be your career, you will soon render that name illustrious. Then, my son, return to the world still more brilliant because of your former sorrows, and if I am wrong, still let me cherish these hopes, for I have no future to look forward to. For me, the grave opens when I pass the threshold of this house. I will fulfill all your wishes, my dear mother, said the young man. Yes, I share your hopes. The anger of heaven will not pursue us, since you are pure and I am innocent. But since our resolution is formed, let us act promptly. Monsieur de Morcerf went out about half an hour ago. The opportunity is favorable to avoid an explanation. I am ready, my son, said Mercédès. Albert ran to fetch a carriage. He recollected that there was a small furnished house to let in the Rue de Saint-Pérez, where his mother would find a humble but decent lodging, and thither he intended conducting the Countess. As the carriage stopped at the door, and Albert was alighting, a man approached and gave him a letter. Albert recognized the bearer. "From the Count," said Bertuccio. Albert took the letter, opened and read it, then looked round for Bertuccio, but he was gone. He returned to Mercédès with tears in his eyes and heaving breast, and without uttering a word he gave her the letter. Mercédès read, "Albert, while showing you that I have discovered your plans, I hope also to convince you of my delicacy. You are free. You leave the Count's house, and you take your mother to your home. But reflect, Albert, you owe her more than your poor noble heart can pay her. Keep the struggle for yourself, bear all the suffering, but spare her the trial of poverty which must accompany your first efforts, for she deserves not even the shadow of the misfortune which has this day fallen on her, and Providence is not willing that the innocent should suffer for the guilty. I know you are going to leave the Rue de Helder without taking anything with you. Do not seek to know how I discovered it. I know it, that is sufficient. Now listen, Albert. 24 years ago I returned, proud and joyful, to my country. I had a betrothed, Albert, a lovely girl whom I adored, and I was bringing to my betrothed 150 louis, painfully amassed by ceaseless toil. This money was for her, I destined it for her, and knowing the treachery of the sea, I buried our treasure in the little garden of the house my father lived in at Marseilles on the Allée de Milan. Your mother, Albert, knows that poor house well. A short time since, I passed through Marseilles, and went to see the old place, which revived so many painful recollections, and in the evening I took a spade and dug in the corner of the garden where I had concealed my treasure. The iron box was there, no one had touched it, under a beautiful fig tree my father had planted the day I was born, which overshadowed the spot. Well, Albert, this money, which was formerly designed to promote the comfort and tranquillity of the woman I adored, may now, through strange and painful circumstances, be devoted to the same purpose. Oh, feel for me, who could offer millions to that poor woman, but who returned her only the piece of black bread forgotten under my poor roof since the day I was torn from her I loved. You are a generous man, Albert, but perhaps you may be blinded by pride or resentment. If you refuse me, if you ask another for what I have a right to offer you, I will say it is ungenerous of you to refuse the life of your mother at the hands of a man whose father was allowed by your father to die in all the horrors of poverty and despair. Albert stood pale and motionless to hear what his mother would decide after she had finished reading this letter. Mercedes turned her eyes with an ineffable look towards heaven. I accept it, said she. He has a right to pay the dowry, which I shall take with me to some convent. Putting the letter in her bosom, she took her son's arm, and with a firmer step than she even herself expected, she went downstairs. End of chapter 91.
Chapter 92 of The Count of Monte Cristo. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 92. The Suicide. Meanwhile, Monte Cristo had also returned to the town with Emmanuel and Maximilian. Their return was cheerful. Emmanuel did not conceal his joy at the peaceful termination of the affair, and was loud in his expressions of delight. Morrel, in a corner of the carriage, allowed his brother-in-law's gaiety to expend itself in words, while he felt equal inward joy, which, however, betrayed itself only in his countenance. At the Barrière du Trône they met Bertuccio, who was waiting there, motionless as a sentinel at his post. Monte Cristo put his head out of the window, exchanged a few words with him in a low tone, and the steward disappeared. "Count," said Emmanuel, when they were at the end of the Place Royale, "put me down at my door, that my wife may not have a single moment of needless anxiety on my account or yours. If it were not ridiculous to make a display of our triumph, I would invite the count to our house. Besides that, he has doubtless some trembling heart to comfort, so we will have to take leave of our friend and let him hasten home." "Stop a moment," said Monte Cristo. "Do not let me lose both my companions. Return, Emmanuel, to your charming wife, and present my best compliments to her. And do you, Morrel, accompany me to the Champs-Élysées." "Willingly," said Maximilian, "particularly as I have business in that quarter." "Shall we wait breakfast for you?" asked Emmanuel. "No," replied the young man. The door was closed, and the carriage proceeded. "See what good fortune I brought you," said Morrel when he was alone with the count. "Have you not thought so?" "Yes," said Monte Cristo. "For that reason I wished to keep you near me." "It is miraculous," continued Morrel, answering his own thoughts. "What?" said Monte Cristo. "What has just happened." "Yes," said the count, "you are right. It is miraculous." "For Albert is brave," resumed Morrel. "Very brave," said Monte Cristo. "I have seen him sleep with a sword suspended over his head." "And I know he has fought 2 duels," said Morrel. "How can you reconcile that with his conduct this morning?" "All owing to your influence," replied Monte Cristo, smiling. "It is well for Albert that he is not in the army," said Morrel. Why? An apology on the ground, said the young captain, shaking his head. Come, said the Count mildly, do not entertain the prejudices of ordinary men, Morrel. Acknowledge that, if Albert is brave, he cannot be a coward. He must then have had some reason for acting as he did this morning, and confess that his conduct is more heroic than otherwise. Doubtless, doubtless, said Morrel, but I shall say like the Spaniard, he has not been so brave today as he was yesterday. You will breakfast with me, will you not, Morrel? Said the Count, to turn the conversation. No, I must leave you at 10 o'clock. Your engagement was for breakfast, then? Said the Count. Morrel smiled and shook his head. Still, you must breakfast somewhere. But if I am not hungry? Said the young man. Oh, said the Count, I only know two things which destroy the appetite. Grief, and as I am happy to see you very cheerful, it is not that, and love. Now after what you have told me this morning of your heart, I may believe— Well, Count, replied Morrel gaily, I will not dispute it. But will you not make me your confidant, Maximilian? Said the Count, in a tone which showed how gladly he would have been admitted to the secret. I showed you this morning that I had a heart, did I not, Count? Monte Cristo only answered by extending his hand to the young man. Well, continued the latter, since that heart is no longer with you in the Bois de Vincennes, it is elsewhere, and I must go and find it. Go, said the Count deliberately. Go, dear friend, but promise me that if you meet with any obstacle, to remember that I have some power in this world, that I am happy to use that power on the behalf of those I love, and that I love you, Morrel. I will remember it, said the young man, as selfish children recollect their parents when they want their aid. When I need your assistance and the moment arrives, I will come to you, Count. Well, I rely upon your promise. Goodbye, then. Goodbye, till we meet again. They had arrived in the Champs-Élysées. Monte Cristo opened the carriage door. Morrel sprang out on the pavement. Bertuccio was waiting on the steps. Morrel disappeared down the Avenue de Marigny, and Monte Cristo hastened to join Bertuccio. Well, asked he. She is going to leave her house, said the steward. And her son? Florentin, his valet, thinks he is going to do the same. Come this way. Monte Cristo took Bertuccio into his study, wrote the letter we have seen, and gave it to the steward. Go, he said quickly, but first let Haydée be informed that I have returned. Here I am, said the young girl, who, at the sound of the carriage, had run downstairs, and whose face was radiant with joy at seeing the Count return safely. Bertuccio left. Every transport of a daughter finding a father, all the delight of a mistress seeing an adored lover, were felt by Haydée during the first moments of this meeting, which she had so eagerly expected. Doubtless, although less evident, Monte Cristo's joy was not less intense. Joy to hearts which have suffered long is like dew on the ground after a long drought. Both the heart and the ground absorb that beneficent moisture falling on them, and nothing is outwardly apparent. Monte Cristo was beginning to think, what he had not for a long time dared to believe, that there were two Mercedes in the world, and he might yet be happy. His eye, elate with happiness, was reading eagerly the tearful gaze of Haydée, when suddenly the door opened. The Count knit his brow. Monsieur de Morcerf, said Baptistin, as if the name sufficed for his excuse. In fact, the Count's face brightened. Which? Asked he. The Viscount or the Count? The Count. Oh, exclaimed Haydée, is it not yet over? I know not if it is finished, my beloved child, said Monte Cristo, taking the young girl's hands. But I do know you have nothing more to fear. But it is the wretched— That man cannot injure me, Haydée, said Monte Cristo. It was his son alone that there was cause to fear. And what I have suffered, said the young girl, you shall never know, my lord. Monte Cristo smiled. By my father's tomb, said he, extending his hand over the head of the young girl, I swear to you, Haydée, that if any misfortune happens, it will not be to me. I believe you, my lord, as implicitly as if God had spoken to me, said the young girl, presenting her forehead to him. Monte Cristo pressed on that pure, beautiful forehead a kiss which made two hearts throb at once, the one violently, the other heavily. Oh, murmured the Count, shall I then be permitted to love again? Ask Monsieur de Morcerf into the drawing-room, said he to Baptistin, while he led the beautiful Greek girl to a private staircase. We must explain this visit, which, although expected by Monte Cristo, is unexpected to our readers. While Mercédès, as we have said, was making a similar inventory of her property to Albert's, while she was arranging her jewels, shutting her drawers, collecting her keys, to leave everything in perfect order, she did not perceive a pale and sinister face at a glass door which threw light into the passage, from which everything could both be seen and heard. He who was thus looking, without being heard or seen, probably heard and saw all that passed in Madame de Morcerf's apartments. From that glass door the pale-faced man went to the Count's bedroom, and raised with a constricted hand the curtain of a window overlooking the courtyard. He remained there 10 minutes, motionless and dumb, listening to the beating of his own heart. For him, those 10 minutes were very long. It was then Albert, returning from his meeting with the Count, perceived his father watching for his arrival behind a curtain, and turned aside. The Count's eye expanded. He knew Albert had insulted the Count dreadfully, and that in every country in the world such an insult would lead to a deadly duel. Albert returned safely, then the Count was revenged. An indescribable ray of joy illumined that wretched countenance like the last ray of the sun before it disappears behind the clouds which bear the aspect, not of a downy couch, but of a tomb. But as we have said, he waited in vain for his son to come to his apartment with the account of his triumph. He easily understood why his son did not come to see him before he went to avenge his father's honor. But when that was done, why did not his son come and throw himself into his arms? It was then, when the Count could not see Albert, that he sent for his servant, who he knew was authorized not to conceal anything from him. 10 minutes afterward, General Morcerf was seen on the steps, in a black coat with a military collar, black pantaloons, and black gloves. He had apparently given previous orders, for as he reached the bottom step, his carriage came from the coach-house, ready for him. The valet threw into the carriage his military cloak, in which 2 swords were wrapped, and, shutting the door, he took his seat by the side of the coachman. The coachman stooped down for his orders. "To the Champs-Élysées," said the general. "The Count of Monte Cristo's. Hurry!" The horses bounded beneath the whip, and in 5 minutes they stood before the Count's door. Monsieur de Morcerf opened the door himself, and as the carriage rolled away, he passed up the walk, rang, and entered the open door with his servant. A moment afterwards, Baptistin announced the Count of Morcerf to Monte Cristo, and the latter, leading Haydée aside, ordered that Morcerf be asked into the drawing-room. The general was pacing the room the 3rd time when, in turning, he perceived Monte Cristo at the door. "Ah, it is Monsieur de Morcerf," said Monte Cristo quietly. "I thought I had not heard aright." "Yes, it is I," said the Count, whom a frightful contraction of the lips prevented from articulating freely. "May I know the cause which procures me the pleasure of seeing Monsieur de Morcerf so early?" "Had you not a meeting with my son this morning?" asked the general. "I had," replied the Count. "And I know that my son had good reason to wish to fight with you, and to endeavor to kill you." "Yes, sir, he had very good ones. But you see that in spite of them he has not killed me, and did not even fight." "Yet he considered you the cause of his father's dishonor, the cause of the fearful ruin which has fallen on my house." "It is true, sir," said Monte Cristo with his dreadful calmness. "A secondary cause, but not the principal." "Doubtless you made, then, some apology or explanation." "I explained nothing, and it was he who apologized to me." "But to what do you attribute this conduct?" "To the conviction, probably, that there was one more guilty than I." "And who was that?" "His father." "That may be," said the Count, turning pale, "but you know the guilty do not like to find themselves convicted." "I know it, and I expected this result." "You expected my son would be a coward?" cried the Count. "Monsieur Albert de Morcerf is no coward," said Monte Cristo. "A man who holds a sword in his hand and sees a mortal enemy within reach of that sword, and does not fight, is a coward. Why is he not here, that I may tell him so?" "Sir," replied Monte Cristo coldly, "I did not expect that you had come here to relate to me your little family affairs. Go and tell Monsieur Albert that, and he may know what to answer you." "Oh, no, no," said the general, smiling faintly. "I did not come for that purpose. You are right. I came to tell you that I also look upon you as my enemy. I came to tell you that I hate you instinctively, that it seems as if I have always known you, and always hated you. And in short, since the young people of the present day will not fight, it remains for us to do so. Do you think so, sir?" "Certainly. And when I told you I had foreseen this result, it is the honor of your visit I alluded to." "So much the better. Are you prepared?" "Yes, sir." "You know that we shall fight till one of us is dead," said the general, whose teeth were clenched with rage. "Until one of us dies," repeated Monte Cristo, moving his head slightly up and down. Let us start, then. We need no witnesses." "Very true," said Monte Cristo. "It is unnecessary. We know each other so well." "On the contrary," said the count, "we know so little of each other." "Indeed," said Monte Cristo with the same indomitable coolness. "Let us see. Are you not the soldier Fernand, who deserted on the eve of the battle of Waterloo? Are you not the Lieutenant Fernand who served as a guide and a spy to the French army in Spain? Are you not the Captain Fernand who betrayed, sold, and murdered his benefactor Ali? And have not all these Fernands, united, made Lieutenant General the Count of Morcerf, peer of France?" "Oh," cried the general, as if branded with a hot iron, "wretch, to reproach me with my shame, when about perhaps to kill me! No, I did not say I was a stranger to you. I know well, demon, that you have penetrated into the darkness of the past, and that you have read, by the light of what torch I know not, every page of my life. But perhaps I may be more honorable in my shame than you under your pompous coverings. No, no, I am aware that you know me, but I know you only as an adventurer sewn up in gold and jewelry. You call yourself in Paris the Count of Monte Cristo, in Italy Sinbad the Sailor, in Malta I forget what. But it is your real name I want to know, in the midst of your 100 names, that I may pronounce it when we meet to fight, at the moment when I plunge my sword through your heart." The Count of Monte Cristo turned dreadfully pale. His eyes seemed to burn with a devouring fire. He leapt towards a dressing-room near his bedroom, and in less than a moment, tearing off his cravat, his coat and waistcoat, he put on a sailor's jacket and hat, from beneath which rolled his long black hair. He returned thus, formidable and implacable, advancing with his arms crossed on his breast, toward the general, who could not understand why he had disappeared, but who, on seeing him again, and feeling his teeth chatter and his legs sink under him, drew back, and only stopped when he found a table to support his clenched hand. "Fernand," cried he, "of my 100 names I need only tell you one to overwhelm you. But you guess it now, do you not? Or rather, you remember it. For, notwithstanding all my sorrows and my tortures, I show you today a face which the happiness of revenge makes young again, a face you must often have seen in your dreams since your marriage with Mercédès, my betrothed." The general, with his head thrown back, hands extended, gaze fixed, looked silently at this dreadful apparition. Then, seeking the wall to support him, he glided along close to it until he reached the door, through which he went out backwards, uttering the single, mournful, lamentable, distressing cry, "Edmond Dantès!" Then, with sighs which were unlike any human sound, he dragged himself to the door, reeled across the courtyard, and, falling into the arms of his valet, he said in a voice scarcely intelligible, "Home, home." The fresh air and the shame he felt at having exposed himself before his servants partly recalled his senses, but the ride was short, and as he drew near his house all his wretchedness revived. He stopped at a short distance from the house and alighted. The door was wide open. A hackney coach was standing in the middle of the yard. A strange sight before so noble a mansion. The count looked at it with terror, but without daring to inquire its meaning. He rushed towards his apartment. 2 persons were coming down the stairs. He had only time to creep into an alcove to avoid them. It was Mercédès, leaning on her son's arm and leaving the house. They passed close by the unhappy being who, concealed behind the damask curtain, almost felt Mercédès' dress brush past him, and his son's warm breath, pronouncing these words, "Courage, mother, come, this is no longer our home." The words died away, the steps were lost in the distance. The general drew himself up, clinging to the curtain. He uttered the most dreadful sob which ever escaped from the bosom of a father abandoned at the same time by his wife and son. He soon heard the clatter of the iron step of the hackney coach, then the coachman's voice, and then the rolling of the heavy vehicle shook the windows. He darted to his bedroom to see once more all he had loved in the world, but the hackney coach drove on, and the head of neither Mercédès nor her son appeared at the window to take a last look at the house or the deserted father and husband. And at the very moment when the wheels of that coach crossed the gateway, a report was heard, and a thick smoke escaped through one of the panes of the window, which was broken by the explosion. End of chapter 92.
Chapter 93 of the Count of Monte Cristo. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 93. Valentine. We may easily conceive where Morrel's appointment was. On leaving Monte Cristo, he walked slowly towards Villefort's. We say slowly, for Morrel had more than half an hour to spare to go 500 steps, but he had hastened to take leave of Monte Cristo because he wished to be alone with his thoughts. He knew his time well, the hour when Valentine was giving Noirtier his breakfast, and was sure not to be disturbed in the performance of this pious duty. Noirtier and Valentine had given him leave to go twice a week, and he was now availing himself of that permission. He had arrived. Valentine was expecting him. Uneasy and almost crazed, she seized his hand and led him to her grandfather. This uneasiness, amounting almost to frenzy, arose from the report Morcerf's adventure had made in the world, for the affair at the opera was generally known. No one at Villefort's doubted that a duel would ensue from it. Valentine, with her woman's instinct, guessed that Morrel would be Monte Cristo's second, and from the young man's well-known courage and his great affection for the count, she feared that he would not content himself with the passive part assigned to him. We may easily understand how eagerly the particulars were asked for, given, and received, and Morrel could read an indescribable joy in the eyes of his beloved when she knew that the termination of this affair was as happy as it was unexpected. "Now," said Valentine, motioning to Morrel to sit down near her grandfather, while she took her seat on his footstool, "now let us talk about our own affairs. You know, Maximilian, grandpapa once thought of leaving this house, and taking an apartment away from Monsieur de Villefort's." "Yes," said Maximilian, "I recollect the project, of which I highly approved." "Well," said Valentine, "you may approve again, for grandpapa is again thinking of it."
"Bravo!"
said Maximilian. "And do you know," said Valentine, "what reason grandpapa gives for leaving this house?" Noirtier looked at Valentine to impose silence, but she did not notice him. Her looks, her eyes, her smile were all for Morrel. "Oh, whatever may be Monsieur Noirtier's reason," answered Morrel, "I can readily believe it to be a good one." "An excellent one," said Valentine. "He pretends the air of the Faubourg Saint Honoré is not good for me." "Indeed," said Morrel, "in that Monsieur Noirtier may be right. You have not seemed to be well for the last fortnight." "Not very," said Valentine, "and grandpapa has become my physician, and I have the greatest confidence in him, because he knows everything." "Do you, then, really suffer?" asked Morrel quickly. "Oh, it must not be called suffering. I feel a general uneasiness, that is all. I have lost my appetite, and my stomach feels as if it were struggling to get accustomed to something." Noirtier did not lose a word of what Valentine said. "And what treatment do you adopt for this singular complaint?" "A very simple one," said Valentine. "I swallow every morning a spoonful of the mixture prepared for my grandfather. When I say 1 spoonful, I began by 1, now I take 4. Grandpapa says it is a panacea." Valentine smiled, but it was evident that she suffered. Maximilian, in his devotedness, gazed silently at her. She was very beautiful, but her usual pallor had increased, her eyes were more brilliant than ever, and her hands, which were generally white like mother of pearl, now more resembled wax, to which time was adding a yellowish hue. From Valentine, the young man looked towards Noirtier. The latter watched with strange and deep interest the young girl, absorbed by her affection, but he also, like Morrel, followed those traces of inward suffering, which was so little perceptible to a common observer that they escaped the notice of everyone but the grandfather and the lover. "But," said Morrel, "I thought this mixture, of which you now take 4 spoonfuls, was prepared for Monsieur Noirtier." "I know it is very bitter," said Valentine, "so bitter that all I drink afterwards appears to have the same taste." Noirtier looked inquiringly at his granddaughter. "Yes, grandpapa," said Valentine, "it is so. Just now, before I came down to you, I drank a glass of sugared water. I left half, because it seemed so bitter." Noirtier turned pale, and made a sign that he wished to speak. Valentine rose to fetch the dictionary. Noirtier watched her with evident anguish. In fact, the blood was rushing to the young girl's head already. Her cheeks were becoming red. "Oh!" cried she, without losing any of her cheerfulness, "this is singular. I can't see. Did the sun shine in my eyes?" And she leaned against the window. "The sun is not shining," said Morrel, more alarmed by Noirtier's expression than by Valentine's indisposition. He ran towards her. The young girl smiled. "Cheer up," said she to Noirtier. "Do not be alarmed, Maximilian. It is nothing, and has already passed away. But listen, do I not hear a carriage in the courtyard?" She opened Noirtier's door, ran to a window in the passage, and returned hastily. "Yes," said she, "it is Madame Danglars and her daughter, who have come to call on us. Good-bye, I must run away, for they would send here for me, or rather, farewell till I see you again. Stay with grandpapa, Maximilian. I promise you not to persuade them to stay." Morrel watched her as she left the room. He heard her ascend the little staircase which led both to Madame de Villefort's apartments and to hers. As soon as she was gone, Noirtier made a sign to Morrel to take the dictionary. Morrel obeyed. Guided by Valentine, he had learned how to understand the old man quickly. Accustomed, however, as he was to the work, he had to repeat most of the letters of the alphabet, and to find every word in the dictionary, so that it was 10 minutes before the thought of the old man was translated by these words: "Fetch the glass of water and the decanter from Valentine's room." Morrel rang immediately for the servant who had taken Barrois's situation, and in Noirtier's name gave that order. The servant soon returned. The decanter and the glass were completely empty. Noirtier made a sign that he wished to speak. "Why are the glass and decanter empty?" asked he. Valentine said she only drank half the glassful. The translation of this new question occupied another 5 minutes. "I do not know," said the servant, "but the housemaid is in Mademoiselle Valentine's room. Perhaps she has emptied them." "Ask her," said Morrel, translating Noirtier's thought this time by his look. The servant went out, but returned almost immediately. "Mademoiselle Valentine passed through the room to go to Madame de Villefort's," said he, "and, in passing, as she was thirsty, she drank what remained in the glass. As for the decanter, Master Edward had emptied that to make a pond for his ducks." Noirtier raised his eyes to heaven, as a gambler does who stakes his all on one stroke. From that moment, the old man's eyes were fixed on the door, and did not quit it. It was indeed Madame Danglars and her daughter whom Valentine had seen. They had been ushered into Madame de Villefort's room, who had said she would receive them there. That is why Valentine passed through her room, which was on a level with Valentine's, and only separated from it by Edward's. The two ladies entered the drawing room with that sort of official stiffness which precludes a formal communication. Among worldly people manner is contagious. Madame de Villefort received them with equal solemnity. Valentine entered at this moment, and the formalities were resumed. "My dear friend," said the baroness, while the two young people were shaking hands, "I and Eugenie are come to be the first to announce to you the approaching marriage of my daughter with Prince Cavalcanti." Danglars kept up the title of prince. The popular banker found that it answered better than count. "Allow me to present you my sincere congratulations," replied Madame de Villefort. "Prince Cavalcanti appears to be a young man of rare qualities." "Listen," said the baroness, smiling. "Speaking to you as a friend, I can say that the prince does not yet appear all he will be. He has about him a little of that foreign manner by which French persons recognize, at first sight, the Italian or German nobleman. Besides, he gives evidence of great kindness of disposition, much keenness of wit, and as to suitability, Monsieur Danglars assures me that his fortune is majestic. That is his word." "And then," said Eugénie, while turning over the leaves of Madame de Villefort's album, "add that you have taken a great fancy to the young man." "And," said Madame de Villefort, "I need not ask you if you share that fancy." "I?" replied Eugénie with her usual candor. "Oh, not the least in the world, madame. My wish was not to confine myself to domestic cares or the caprices of any man, but to be an artist, and consequently free in heart, in person, and in thought." Eugénie pronounced these words with so firm a tone that the color mounted to Valentine's cheeks. The timid girl could not understand that vigorous nature which appeared to have none of the timidities of woman. "At any rate," said she, "since I am to be married whether I will or not, I ought to be thankful to Providence for having released me from my engagement with Monsieur Albert de Morcerf, or I should this day have been the wife of a dishonored man." "It is true," said the baroness, with that strange simplicity sometimes met with among fashionable ladies, and of which plebeian intercourse can never entirely deprive them. "It is very true that had not the Morcerfs hesitated, my daughter would have married Monsieur Albert. The general depended much on it. He even came to force Monsieur Danglars. We have had a narrow escape." "But," said Valentine, timidly, "does all the father's shame revert upon the son? Monsieur Albert appears to me quite innocent of the treason charged against the general." "Excuse me," said the implacable young girl. "Monsieur Albert claims and well deserves his share. It appears that after having challenged Monsieur de Monte Cristo at the opera yesterday, he apologized on the ground today." "Impossible!" said Madame de Villefort. "Ah, my dear friend," said Madame Danglars, with the same simplicity we before noticed, "it is a fact. I heard it from Monsieur Debray, who was present at the explanation." Valentine also knew the truth, but she did not answer. A single word had reminded her that Morrel was expecting her in Monsieur Noirtier's room. Deeply engaged, with a sort of inward contemplation, Valentine had ceased for a moment to join in the conversation. She would, indeed, have found it impossible to repeat what had been said in the last few minutes, when suddenly Madame Danglars' hand, pressed on her arm, aroused her from her lethargy. "What is it?" said she, starting at Madame Danglars' touch as she would have done from an electric shock. "It is, my dear Valentine," said the baroness, "that you are doubtless suffering." "I?" said the young girl, passing her hand across her burning forehead. "Yes, look at yourself in that glass. You have turned pale and then red successively, 3 or 4 times in 1 minute." "Indeed," cried Eugénie, "you are very pale." "Oh, do not be alarmed. I have been so for many days." Artless as she was, the young girl knew that this was an opportunity to leave, and besides, Madame de Villefort came to her assistance. "Retire, Valentine," said she. "You are really suffering, and these ladies will excuse you. Drink a glass of pure water, it will restore you." Valentine kissed Eugénie, bowed to Madame Danglars, who had already risen to take her leave, and went out. "That poor child," said Madame de Villefort, when Valentine was gone, "she makes me very uneasy, and I should not be astonished if she had some serious illness." Meanwhile, Valentine, in a sort of excitement which she could not understand, had crossed Edward's room without noticing some trick of the child, and through her own had reached the little staircase. She was within 3 steps of the bottom. She already heard Morrel's voice, when suddenly a cloud passed over her eyes, her stiffened foot missed the step, her hands had no power to hold the baluster, and falling against the wall, she lost her balance wholly and toppled to the floor. Morrel bounded to the door, opened it, and found Valentine stretched out at the bottom of the stairs. Quick as a flash, he raised her in his arms and placed her in a chair. Valentine opened her eyes. "Oh, what a clumsy thing I am!" said she with feverish volubility. "I don't know my way. I forgot there were 3 more steps before the landing." "You have hurt yourself, perhaps," said Morrel. "What can I do for you, Valentine?" Valentine looked around her. She saw the deepest terror depicted in Noirtier's eyes. "Don't worry, dear grandpapa," said she, endeavoring to smile. "It is nothing, it is nothing. I was giddy, that is all." "Another attack of giddiness?" said Morrel, clasping his hands. "Oh, attend to it, Valentine, I entreat you." "But no," said Valentine, "no, I tell you, it is all past, and it was nothing. Now let me tell you some news. Eugenie is to be married in a week, and in 3 days there is to be a grand feast, a betrothal festival. We are all invited, my father, Madame de Villefort, and I. At least, I understood it so. When will it be our turn to think of these things? Oh, Valentine, you who have so much influence over your grandpapa, try to make him answer soon." "And do you," said Valentine, "depend on me to stimulate the tardiness and arouse the memory of grandpapa?" "Yes," cried Morrel, "make haste. So long as you are not mine, Valentine, I shall always think I may lose you." "Oh," replied Valentine with convulsive movement, "oh, indeed, Maximilian, you are too timid for an officer, for a soldier who, they say, never knows fear. Ah, ha, ha!" She burst into a forced and melancholy laugh. Her arms stiffened and twisted. Her head fell back on her chair, and she remained motionless. The cry of terror which was stopped on Noirtier's lips seemed to start from his eyes. Morrel understood it. He knew he must call assistance. The young man rang the bell violently. The housemaid who had been in Mademoiselle Valentine's room, and the servant who had replaced Barrois, ran in at the same moment. Valentine was so pale, so cold, so inanimate, that without listening to what was said to them, they were seized with the fear which pervaded that house, and they flew into the passage crying for help. Madame Danglars and Eugenie were going out at that moment. They heard the cause of the disturbance. "I told you so," exclaimed Madame de Villefort. "Poor child!" End of chapter 93.
Chapter 94 of the Count of Monte Cristo. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 94. Maximilian's avowal. At the same moment, M. de Villefort's voice was heard calling from his study. "What is the matter?" Morrel looked at Noirtier, who had recovered his self-command, and with a glance indicated the closet, where once before, under somewhat similar circumstances, he had taken refuge. He had only time to get his hat and throw himself breathless into the closet when the procureur's footstep was heard in the passage. Villefort sprang into the room, ran to Valentine, and took her in his arms. "A physician! A physician! Monsieur d'Avrigny!" cried Villefort. "Or rather, I will go for him myself." He flew from the apartment, and Morrel at the same moment darted out at the other door. He had been struck to the heart by a frightful recollection. The conversation he had heard between the doctor and Villefort the night of Madame de Saint-Méran's death recurred to him. These symptoms, to a less alarming extent, were the same which had preceded the death of Barrois. At the same time Monte Cristo's voice seemed to resound in his ear, with the words he had heard only 2 hours before. "Whatever you want, Morrel, come to me. I have great power." More rapidly than thought he darted down the Rue Matignon, and thence to the Avenue des Champs-Élysées. Meanwhile, M. de Villefort arrived in a hired cabriolet at M. d'Avrigny's door. He rang so violently that the porter was alarmed. Villefort ran upstairs without saying a word. The porter knew him, and let him pass, only calling to him, "In his study, Monsieur Procureur, in his study." Villefort pushed, or rather forced, the door open. "Ah," said the doctor, "is it you?" "Yes, said Villefort, closing the door after him. "It is I who am come in my turn to ask you if we are quite alone. Doctor, my house is accursed." "What?" said the latter, with apparent coolness, but with deep emotion. "Have you another invalid?" "Yes, doctor," cried Villefort, clutching his hair. "Yes." d'Avrigny's look implied, "I told you it would be so." Then he slowly uttered these words: "Who is now dying in your house? What new victim is going to accuse you of weakness before God?" A mournful sob burst from Villefort's heart. He approached the doctor, and seizing his arm, "Valentine," said he, "it is Valentine's turn." "Your daughter?" cried d'Avrigny, with grief and surprise. "You see you were deceived," murmured the magistrate. "Come and see her, and on her bed of agony entreat her pardon for having suspected her." "Each time you have applied to me," said the doctor, "it has been too late. Still I will go. But let us make haste, sir. With the enemies you have to do with, there is no time to be lost." "Oh, this time, doctor, you shall not have to reproach me with weakness. This time I will know the assassin and will pursue him." "Let us try first to save the victim, before we think of revenging her," said d'Avrigny. "Come." The same cabriolet which had brought Villefort took them back at full speed, and at this moment Morrel rapped at Monte Cristo's door. The count was in his study, and was reading, with an angry look, something which Bertuccio had brought in haste. Hearing the name of Morrel, who had left him only 2 hours before, the count raised his head, arose, and sprang to meet him. "What is the matter, Maximilian?" asked he. "You are pale, and the perspiration rolls from your forehead." Morrel fell into a chair. "Yes," said he, "I came quickly. I wanted to speak to you." "Are all your family well?" asked the count, with an affectionate benevolence whose sincerity no one could for a moment doubt. "Thank you, count, thank you," said the young man, evidently embarrassed how to begin the conversation. "Yes, everyone in my family is well." "So much the better. Yet you have something to tell me?" replied the count with increased anxiety. "Yes," said Morrel, "it is true. I have but now left a house where death has just entered, to run to you." "Are you then come from Monsieur de Morcerf's?" asked Monte Cristo. "No," said Morrel. "Is someone dead in his house?" "The general has just blown his brains out," replied Monte Cristo with great coolness. "Oh, what a dreadful event!" cried Maximilian. "Not for the countess or for Albert," said Monte Cristo. "A dead father or husband is better than a dishonored one. Blood washes out shame." "Poor countess," said Maximilian. "I pity her very much. She is so noble a woman." "Pity Albert also, Maximilian, for believe me, he is the worthy son of the countess. But let us return to yourself. You have hastened to me. Can I have the happiness of being useful to you?" "Yes, I need your help. That is, I thought like a madman that you could lend me your assistance in a case where God alone can succor me." "Tell me what it is," replied Monte Cristo. "Oh," said Morrel, "I know not indeed if I may reveal this secret to mortal ears, but fatality impels me, necessity constrains me. Count—" Morrel hesitated. "Do you think I love you?" said Monte Cristo, taking the young man's hand affectionately in his. "Oh, you encourage me, and something tells me there," placing his hand on his heart, "that I ought to have no secret from you." "You are right, Morrel. God is speaking to your heart, and your heart speaks to you. Tell me what it says." "Count, will you allow me to send Baptistin to inquire after someone you know?" "I am at your service, and still more my servant's." "Oh, I cannot live if she is not better." "Shall I ring for Baptistin?" "No, I will go and speak to him myself." Morrel went out, called Baptistin, and whispered a few words to him. The valet ran directly. "Well, have you sent?" asked Monte Cristo, seeing Morrel return. "Yes, and now I shall be more calm." "You know I am waiting," said Monte Cristo, smiling. "Yes, and I will tell you. One evening I was in a garden. A clump of trees concealed me. No one suspected I was there. 2 persons passed near me, Allow me to conceal their names for the present. They were speaking in an undertone, and yet I was so interested in what they had to say that I did not lose a single word. This is a gloomy introduction, if I may judge from your pallor and shuddering, Morrel. Oh yes, very gloomy, my friend. Someone had just died in the house to which that garden belonged. One of the persons whose conversation I overheard was the master of the house, the other the physician. The former was confiding to the latter his grief and fear, for it was the second time within a month that death had suddenly and unexpectedly entered that house, which was apparently destined to destruction by some exterminating angel as an object of God's anger. Ah, indeed, said Monte Cristo, looking earnestly at the young man, and by an imperceptible movement turning his chair so that he remained in the shade while the light fell full on Maximilian's face. Yes, continued Morrel, death had entered that house twice within 1 month. And what did the doctor answer? Asked Monte Cristo. He replied that the death was not a natural one, and must be attributed— To what? To poison. Indeed, said Monte Cristo, with a slight cough which in moments of extreme emotion helped him to disguise a blush or his pallor, or the intense interest with which he listened. Indeed, Maximilian, did you hear that? Yes, my dear Count, I heard it, and the doctor added that if another death occurred in a similar way, he must appeal to justice. Monte Cristo listened, or appeared to do so, with great calmness. Well, said Maximilian, death came a third time, and neither the master of the house nor the doctor said a word. Death is now perhaps striking a fourth blow. Count, what am I bound to do, being in possession of this secret? My dear friend, said Monte Cristo, you appear to be relating an adventure which we all know by heart. I know the house where you heard it, or one very similar to it, a house with a garden, a master, a physician, and where there have been 3 unexpected and sudden deaths. Well, I have not intercepted your confidence, and yet I know all that as well as you, and I have no conscientious scruples. No, it does not concern me. You say an exterminating angel appears to have devoted that house to God's anger. Well, who says your supposition is not reality? Do not notice things which those whose interest it is to see them pass over. If it is God's justice instead of his anger which is walking through that house, Maximilian, turn away your face and let his justice accomplish its purpose. Morrel shuddered. There was something mournful, solemn, and terrible in the Count's manner. Besides, continued he, and so changed a tone that no one would have supposed it was the same person speaking, besides, who says that it will begin again? It has returned, Count, exclaimed Morrel. That is why I hasten to you. Well, what do you wish me to do? Do you wish me, for instance, to give information to the procureur? Monte Cristo uttered the last words with so much meaning that Morrel, starting up, cried out, "You know of whom I speak, Count, do you not?" "Perfectly well, my good friend, and I will prove it to you by putting the dots to the i's, or rather by naming the persons. You were walking one evening in Monsieur de Villefort's garden. From what you relate, I suppose it to have been the evening of Madame de Saint-Méran's death. You heard Monsieur de Villefort talking to Monsieur d'Avrigny about the death of Monsieur de Saint-Méran, and that no less surprising of the Countess. Monsieur d'Avrigny said he believed that both proceeded from poison. And you, honest man, have ever since been asking your heart and sounding your conscience to know if you ought to expose or conceal this secret. Why do you torment them? Conscience, what hast thou to do with me, as Sterne said? My dear fellow, let them sleep on if they are asleep. Let them grow pale in their drowsiness, if they are disposed to do so, and pray do remain in peace, who have no remorse to disturb you. Deep grief was depicted on Morrel's features. He seized the Count's hand. "But it is beginning again, I say." "Well," said the Count, astonished at his perseverance, which he could not understand, and looking still more earnestly at Maximilian, "let it begin again. It is like the house of Atreides. Note, in the old Greek legend of Atreides, or children of Atreus, were doomed to punishment because of the abominable crime of their father. The Agamemnon of Aeschylus is based on this legend. End note. God has condemned them, and they must submit to their punishment. They will all disappear like the fabrics children build with cards, and which fall one by one under the breath of their builder, even if there are 200 of them. 3 months since it was Monsieur de Saint-Méran, Madame de Saint-Méran 2 months since. The other day it was Barrois. Today the old Noirtier or young Valentine. "You knew it?" cried Morrel, in such a paroxysm of terror that Monte Cristo started, he whom the falling heavens would have found unmoved. "You knew it, and said nothing." "And what is it to me?" replied Monte Cristo, shrugging his shoulders. "Do I know these people, and must I lose the one to save the other? Faith, no, for between the culprit and the victim I have no choice." "But I," cried Morrel, groaning with sorrow, "I love her." "You love whom?" cried Monte Cristo, starting to his feet and seizing the 2 hands which Morrel was raising toward heaven. "I love most fondly, I love madly, I love as a man who would give his life-blood to spare her a tear. I love Valentine de Villefort, who is being murdered at this moment. Do you understand me? I love her, and I ask God and you how I can save her." Monte Cristo uttered a cry which those only can conceive who have heard the roar of a wounded lion. "Unhappy man!" cried he, wringing his hands in his turn. "You love Valentine, that daughter of an accursed race!" Never had Morrel witnessed such an expression. Never had so terrible an eye flashed before his face. Never had the genius of terror he had so often seen, either on the battlefield or in the murderous nights of Algeria, shaken around him more dreadful fire. He drew back, terrified. As for Monte Cristo, after this ebullition he closed his eyes as if dazzled by internal light. In a moment he restrained himself so powerfully that the tempestuous heaving of his breast subsided, as turbulent and foaming waves yield to the sun's genial influence when the cloud has passed. This silent self-control and struggle lasted about 20 seconds. Then the count raised his pallid face. "See," said he, "my dear friend, how God punishes the most thoughtless and unfeeling men for their indifference by presenting dreadful scenes to their view. I, who was looking on, an eager and curious spectator, I, who was watching the working of this mournful tragedy, I, who, like a wicked angel, was laughing at the evil men committed, protected by secrecy. A secret is easily kept by the rich and powerful. I am in my turn bitten by the serpent, whose tortuous course I was watching, and bitten to the heart." Morrel groaned. "Come, come," continued the count, "complaints are unavailing. Be a man, be strong, be full of hope, for I am here, and will watch over you." Morrel shook his head sorrowfully. "I tell you to hope. Do you understand me?" cried Monte Cristo. "Remember that I never uttered a falsehood, and am never deceived. It is 12 o'clock, Maximilian. Thank heaven that you came at noon rather than in the evening or tomorrow morning. Listen, Morrel, it is noon. If Valentine is not dead, she will not die." "How so?" cried Morrel, "when I left her dying?" Monte Cristo pressed his hands to his forehead. What was passing in that brain so loaded with dreadful secrets? What does the angel of light or the angel of darkness say to that mind, at once implacable and generous? God only knows. Monte Cristo raised his head once more, and this time he was calm as a child awaking from its sleep. "Maximilian," he said, "return home. I command you not to stir. Attempt nothing, not to let your countenance betray a thought, and I will send you tidings. Go." "Oh, count, you overwhelm me with that coolness. Have you, then, power against death? Are you superhuman? Are you an angel?" And the young man, who had never shrunk from danger, shrank before Monte Cristo with indescribable terror. Monte Cristo looked at him with so melancholy and sweet a smile that Maximilian felt the tears filling his eyes. "I can do much for you, my friend," replied the count. "Go, I must be alone." Morrel, subdued by the extraordinary ascendancy Monte Cristo exercised over everything around him, did not endeavour to resist it. He pressed the Count's hand and left. He stopped one moment at the door for Baptistin, whom he saw in the Rue Matignon, and who was running. Meanwhile, Villefort and d'Avrigny had made all possible haste. Valentine had not revived from her fainting fit on their arrival, and the doctor examined the invalid with all the care the circumstances demanded, and with an interest which the knowledge of the secret intensified twofold. Villefort, closely watching his countenance and his lips, awaited the result of the examination. Noirtier, paler than even the young girl, more eager than Villefort for the decision, was watching also intently and affectionately. At last d'Avrigny slowly uttered these words: "She is still alive." "Still?" cried Villefort. "Oh, doctor, what a dreadful word is that!" "Yes," said the physician, "I repeat, she is alive, and I am astonished at it." "But she is safe?" asked the father. "Yes, since she lives." At that moment d'Avrigny's glance met Noirtier's eye. It glistened with such extraordinary joy, so rich and full of thought, that the physician was struck. He placed the young girl again on the chair. Her lips were scarcely discernible, they were so pale and white, as well as her whole face, and remained motionless, looking at Noirtier, who appeared to anticipate and command all he did. "Sir," said d'Avrigny to Villefort, "call Mademoiselle Valentine's maid, if you please." Villefort went himself to find her, and d'Avrigny approached Noirtier. "Have you something to tell me?" asked he. The old man winked his eyes expressively, which we may remember was his only way of expressing his approval. "Privately?" "Yes." "Well, I will remain with you." At this moment Villefort returned, followed by the lady's maid, and after her came Madame de Villefort. "What is the matter, then, with this dear child? She has just left me, and she complained of being indisposed, but I did not think seriously of it." The young woman, with tears in her eyes and every mark of affection of a true mother, approached Valentine and took her hand. d'Avrigny continued to look at Noirtier. He saw the eyes of the old man dilate and become round, his cheeks turn pale and tremble, the perspiration stood in drops upon his forehead. "Ah," said he, involuntarily following Noirtier's eyes, which were fixed on Madame de Villefort, who repeated, "This poor child would be better in bed. Come, Fanny, we will put her to bed." M. d'Avrigny, who saw that this would be a means of his remaining alone with Noirtier, expressed his opinion that it was the best thing that could be done, but he forbade that anything should be given to her except what he ordered. They carried Valentine away. She had revived, but could scarcely move or speak, so shaken was her frame by the attack. She had, however, just power to give one parting look to her grandfather, who, in losing her, seemed to be resigning his very soul. d'Avrigny followed the invalid, wrote a prescription, ordered Villefort to take a cabriolet, go in person to a chemist's and get the prescribed medicine, bring it himself, and wait for him in his daughter's room. Then, having renewed his injunction not to give Valentine anything, he went down again to Noirtier, shut the doors carefully, and after convincing himself that no one was listening, "Do you," said he, "know anything of this young lady's illness?" "Yes," said the old man. "We have no time to lose. I will question, and do you answer me." Noirtier made a sign that he was ready to answer. "Did you anticipate the accident which has happened to your granddaughter?" "Yes." d'Avrigny reflected a moment, and approaching Noirtier, "Pardon what I am going to say," added he, "but no indication should be neglected in this terrible situation. Did you see poor Barrois die?" Noirtier raised his eyes to heaven. "Do you know of what he died?" asked d'Avrigny, placing his hand on Noirtier's shoulder. "Yes," replied the old man. "Do you think he died a natural death?" A sort of smile was discernible on the motionless lips of Noirtier. "Then you have thought that Barrois was poisoned?" "Yes." "Do you think the poison he fell a victim to was intended for him?" "No." Do you think the same hand which unintentionally struck Barrois has now attacked Valentine? Yes. Then will she die too? Asked d'Avrigny, fixing his penetrating gaze on Noirtier. He watched the effect of this question on the old man. No, replied he, with an air of triumph which would have puzzled the most clever diviner. Then you hope? said d'Avrigny with surprise. Yes. What do you hope? The old man made him understand with his eyes that he could not answer. Ah, yes, it is true, murmured d'Avrigny. Then turning to Noirtier, do you hope the assassin will be tried? No. Then you hope the poison will take no effect on Valentine? Yes. It is no news to you, added d'Avrigny, to tell you that an attempt has been made to poison her. The old man made a sign that he entertained no doubt upon the subject. Then how do you hope Valentine will escape? Noirtier kept his eyes steadfastly fixed on the same spot. d'Avrigny followed the direction, and saw that they were fixed on a bottle containing the mixture which he took every morning. Ah, indeed, said d'Avrigny, struck with a sudden thought. Has it occurred to you? Noirtier did not let him finish. Yes, said he. To prepare her system to resist poison? Yes. By accustoming her by degrees? Yes, 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 said Noirtier, delighted to be understood. Of course, I had told you that there was brucine in the mixture I gave you. Yes. And by accustoming her to that poison, you have endeavoured to neutralize the effect of a similar poison? Noirtier's joy continued. And you have succeeded, exclaimed d'Avrigny. Without that precaution, Valentine would have died before assistance could have been procured. The dose has been excessive, but she has only been shaken by it, and this time at any rate, Valentine will not die. A superhuman joy expanded the old man's eyes, which were raised towards heaven with an expression of infinite gratitude. At this moment Villefort returned. "Here, doctor," said he, "is what you sent me for." "Was this prepared in your presence?" "Yes," replied the procureur. "Have you let it go out of your hands?" "No." d'Avrigny took the bottle, poured some drops of the mixture it contained into the hollow of his hand, and swallowed them. "Well," said he, "let us go to Valentine. I will give instructions to everyone, and you, Monsieur de Villefort, will yourself see that no one deviates from them." At that moment, when d'Avrigny was returning to Valentine's room accompanied by Villefort, an Italian priest of serious demeanour and calm and firm tone hired for his use the house adjoining the hotel of Monsieur de Villefort. No one knew how the 3 former tenants of that house left it. About 2 hours afterwards its foundation was reported to be unsafe, but the report did not prevent the new occupant establishing himself there with his modest furniture the same day at 5 o'clock. The lease was drawn up for 3, 6, or 9 years by the new tenant, who, according to the rule of the proprietor, paid 6 months in advance. This new tenant, as we have said, was an Italian, and called Il Signor Giacomo Busoni. Workmen were immediately called in, and that same night the passengers at the end of the Faubourg saw with surprise that carpenters and masons were occupied in repairing the lower part of the tottering house. End of chapter 94.